Look at a photo of people from around the world. Really look at it. You'll see hundreds of variations in how we look. Different skin tones, hair textures, nose shapes, lip sizes. We're all human, all the same species, but we look remarkably different depending on where our ancestors came from. And here's the thing, most of us just accept these differences without ever asking why. Why do people from Northern Europe tend to have lighter skin? Why do people from East and Central Asia often have what we call epicanthic folds, the distinctive eye shape that makes the eyes appear smaller or more almond-shaped? It's a question everyone has wondered about at some point, scrolling through their feed, watching a movie, sitting in a diverse classroom or office. But it feels awkward to ask out loud, doesn't it? Like you're not supposed to notice, or maybe you're afraid the question itself sounds wrong somehow. But here's the truth. It's not wrong to wonder. It's actually one of the most fascinating questions in all of human evolutionary history. And the answer isn't simple. It's not just one thing. It's a story that spans hundreds of thousands of years, involves ice ages that nearly killed us all, takes us to the highest mountains on Earth, and reveals how our ancestors survived conditions that would kill most of us today within hours. If you're using this to fall asleep, perfect. That's exactly why I make these. So maybe subscribe and tell me where you are and what time it is right now. I love checking comments and seeing Tokyo at dawn, London at lunch, California at midnight, all listening to the same story about where we all came from. The question of why East and Central Asian populations develop distinctive eye shapes isn't just about eyes. It's a window into one of the most dramatic chapters of human survival. It involves the same population bottleneck that nearly extinguished humanity 900,000 years ago. It connects to the last ice age when our ancestors pushed into the coldest, harshest environments on Earth. It ties into high-altitude adaptations that let people thrive where the air is so thin, most of us would pass out from oxygen deprivation. And it reveals something profound about how quickly humans can adapt to extreme conditions when survival demands it. Scientists have been studying this question for over a century, and they've proposed multiple theories. Some thought it was purely about protecting eyes from Arctic winds and snow glare. Others believed it was about living at extreme altitudes where UV radiation is intense. Some argued it was sexual selection, that these features became preferred because they were associated with successful, surviving populations. And modern genetics has added entirely new layers to the mystery, showing us that the answer is probably all of these things and more, working together in ways we're only beginning to understand. What makes this story perfect for drifting off to sleep is that it's not just dry scientific facts. It's about real people, your ancestors, my ancestors, all of our ancestors, people who looked up at glaciers the size of mountains and decided to walk toward them instead of away, people who climbed to elevations where water boils at temperatures too low to cook food properly and figured out how to survive anyway, people who adapted generation after generation to environments so extreme that their very faces changed in response. And here's what's really mind-blowing. These changes happened relatively recently in evolutionary terms. We're not talking about millions of years. We're talking about the last 40,000 years, maybe less. In the blink of an eye, evolutionarily speaking, human populations diverged into the incredible diversity we see today. Eye shapes, skin colors, body proportions, all of it fine-tuned by natural selection responding to local environments. The epicanthic fold, that small piece of skin in the inner corner of the eyelid that partially covers the inner corner of the eye, is found in roughly 40% of the world's population. It's most common in East Asian, Southeast Asian, Central Asian, and many indigenous populations from the Arctic and the Americas. But it also appears in some African populations, some indigenous peoples of the Americas, and even occasionally in European populations. It's not exclusive to one group. It's a feature that appeared multiple times in human history, in different places for different reasons, which tells us something profound about how evolution works. Tonight, we're going to trace this story from the frozen waste of Siberia during the last glacial maximum to the Tibetan plateau where people live at heights that would hospitalize most of us. We're going to look at the genetics, the climate science, the archaeology, and yes, even the cultural perceptions that have shaped how we think about eye shapes throughout history. We're going to see how a simple question about physical appearance opens up into an epic tale of human endurance, adaptation, and survival against odds that should have been impossible. So get comfortable. Let your mind wander back through time. We're about to explore one of the most visible reminders that humans aren't just one thing. We're a species that conquered every environment Earth could throw at us, and our faces tell that story if you know how to read them. Before we dive into the evolutionary story of how different human populations adapted their eye structures to survive ice ages and scale mountain ranges, we need to understand what we're actually talking about. Because here's the thing, most people don't really know what makes eyes look different. They just notice the difference and move on. But the reality is far more interesting than you'd think. Let's start with the basics. Your eye, the actual eyeball itself, is pretty much the same size in every human population on Earth. Seriously. If you could somehow extract eyeballs from people of different ancestries and line them up on a table, you'd be hard-pressed to tell which came from where. The average human eyeball measures about 24 millimeters in diameter. It varies slightly between individuals, but not between populations. An East Asian person doesn't have smaller eyeballs than a European person. A person of African descent doesn't have larger eyeballs than someone from South America. The eye itself, that sphere of tissue and fluid that actually does the seeing, is remarkably uniform across our species. So if the eyes themselves are the same size, why do they look different? The answer lies not in the eye, but in everything around it. The architecture, the framework, the soft tissue structures that surround, protect, and present the eye to the world. This is where human variation gets really interesting. Think of it like this. You have two identical windows, same size, same glass, same everything. But you install them in two different houses with two different architectural styles. One house has wide, simple frames. The other has elaborate moulding, shutters, decorative trim. The windows themselves are identical, but they look completely different because of how they're framed and presented. That's essentially what's happening with human eyes. The key structures we're talking about are the eyelids, the fat deposits around the eye socket, the shape of the eye socket itself, and the skin folds that create what we perceive as eye shape. These structures evolved under different environmental pressures in different parts of the world, creating the stunning diversity of eye appearances we see today. Now, the structure that gets the most attention when people talk about East Asian eyes is something called the epicanthic fold. But here's what's weird. Most people have never actually had anyone explain to them what this is. They just know it's, that thing that makes Asian eyes look Asian. But let's be precise about this. The epicanthic fold is a small fold of skin that comes down from the upper eyelid and covers the inner corner of the eye. Specifically, it covers a little pink bit called the lacrimal carbuncle, that fleshy part in the corner of your eye near your nose. In populations without prominent epicanthic folds, this inner corner is exposed and visible. In populations with prominent epicanthic folds, it's partially or completely covered by this descending fold of skin. That's it. That's the whole thing. A small variation in how the skin of the upper eyelid is structured. But this small variation creates a cascade of visual effects. It changes the apparent shape of the eye. It affects how the eyelashes are displayed. It influences the appearance of the eyelid crease, or whether there's a visible crease at all. It's a minor anatomical difference that has major visual impact. But here's where things get interesting, and where a lot of misconceptions start to crumble. Epicanthic folds aren't unique to East Asian populations. They're not even particularly rare in other populations. They show up all over the world in populations that have zero recent genetic connection to East Asia. Indigenous peoples across the Arctic, from Greenland to Siberia, commonly have epicanthic folds. Many populations in Central Asia display them. They appear frequently among the San people of southern Africa. They show up in some Scandinavian populations. They're found among indigenous peoples in the Americas, from Alaska to Tierra del Fuego. And here's something most people don't know. All human babies are born with epicanthic folds. All of them. In most populations, these folds disappear as the child's face develops and the nasal bridge rises during the first few years of life. But in some populations, they persist into adulthood. This tells us something important. The genetic programming for epicanthic folds is part of the basic human developmental toolkit. It's not some weird mutation that appeared once in Asia and stayed there. It's a feature that can be turned on or off, strengthened or diminished, through relatively simple genetic changes. Different populations have kept or lost this feature based on whether it provided advantages in their specific environments. So we're not talking about different species here, not even really about different races. We're talking about different settings on the same basic human template, like adjusting sliders in a character creation screen. Some populations turn the epicanthic fold slider up, others turned it down, but everyone has the slider. Beyond the epicanthic fold, there are other variations in eye structure that create the diversity we see. The amount of fat deposits around the eye varies between populations. Some groups tend to have thicker fat pads, which creates fuller-looking eyelids. Others have less orbital fat, creating deeper-set eyes with more prominent bone structure. The angle at which the eyelid meets the eye can vary, creating what people describe as upward slanting or downward slanting eyes. The prominence of the brow ridge, that bone above the eye, differs dramatically between populations and between individuals. The distance between the eyes, measured from pupil to pupil, shows variation both within and between populations. And then there's the eyelid crease itself, that fold line in the upper eyelid. Some people have a pronounced crease, some have a barely visible crease, some have no visible crease at all. This variation exists within families, within ethnic groups, within every human population. It's controlled by multiple genes and affected by age, weight, and other factors. The point is, eye shape exists on multiple spectrums. It's not a binary. It's not Asian eyes versus everyone else. It's a complex, multi-dimensional variation that reflects humanity's incredible adaptive flexibility. Every population has its own distribution of these features, with overlap between groups being far more common than stark differences. I'm curious about something. If you're settling into sleep right now, listening to this, where in the world are you? What time is it where you are? Drop a comment and let me know. I find it fascinating thinking about how this video might be helping someone drift off in Tokyo at midnight, while someone else in Rio is listening at 2 a.m. and someone in Stockholm is using it for an afternoon nap. We're all humans, all carrying the same basic anatomy, all descendants of those bottleneck survivors, but scattered across time zones and continents, each of us with our own unique combination of features that tell the story of where our ancestors adapted and survived. Because that's what we're really talking about here. These variations in eye structure aren't random. They're not meaningless. They're the visible legacy of hundreds of thousands of years of human adaptation to different environments. They're survival strategies written in flesh and skin and bone. The epicanthic fold, the fat deposits, the eyelid structure, all of it represents solutions to environmental challenges that our ancestors faced. But what challenges? What environmental pressures could possibly make eye shape matter for survival? That's where things get really interesting. That's where we need to travel back in time and north in latitude, to a world of ice and wind and blinding snow. To understand why some human populations developed prominent epicanthic folds and the distinctive eye structures we associate with East Asian features, we need to understand what they were surviving. And what they were surviving was arguably the harshest environment humans had ever attempted to inhabit. Let me take you there now. Now let's talk about ice. Not the ice you put in drinks, but the kind that covers continents. The kind that transforms entire hemispheres into frozen wastelands. The kind that forces human populations to either adapt or die. 26,000 years ago, the world entered what scientists call the last glacial maximum. If you think winters are bad now, you have no idea. Ice sheets 2 miles thick covered Canada, northern Europe and vast stretches of Asia. Sea levels dropped 400 feet because so much water was locked up in glaciers. You could walk from mainland Asia to Japan. Britain was connected to France. Indonesia was mostly one giant landmass. But the real story wasn't the ice sheets themselves. It was what happened in the regions just beyond them, the areas where humans were actually trying to live. Northeast Asia and Siberia became some of the coldest, harshest environments humans had ever attempted to colonize. We're not talking about the kind of cold where you wear an extra sweater. We're talking about winters where temperatures regularly drop to -40, -50 degrees Fahrenheit. Summers that barely reached above freezing. Wind chills that could kill an exposed human in minutes. And yet, humans went there anyway. Not because they wanted to, but because populations were expanding, following game animals north, exploring new territories. Some groups pushed into these frozen zones and faced a brutal choice: adapt or retreat. Those who retreated, we don't talk about. Those who adapted, their descendants are the ones who interest us now. Because something happened to those Ice Age survivors. Something visible. Something that would mark their descendants for tens of thousands of years. Their eyes changed. Now, here's where things get interesting. The traditional theory, the one you've probably heard before, goes like this. The epicanthic fold, that distinctive feature that creates what people call Asian eyes, evolved as a cold weather adaptation. Natural selection favouring individuals whose eye structure provided better protection against the brutal conditions of Ice Age Siberia. But let's dig deeper. Let's get specific about what this actually means. Picture yourself standing in the Siberian tundra 20,000 years ago. The wind is constant, cutting through anything you're wearing like it isn't even there. You're hunting mammoth or reindeer because that's the only food source that exists in meaningful quantities. And you need to see. Your survival depends on spotting game at a distance, reading weather patterns, navigating across featureless white landscapes where one wrong turn means death. But seeing is hard when your eyes are constantly under assault. The wind whips particles of ice and snow into your face with every gust. The sun, even in winter, reflects off endless expanses of snow with blinding intensity. Ever had snow blindness? It's not metaphorical. It's a real condition where UV light reflected off snow literally burns your corneas. People who've experienced it describe feeling like someone threw sand in their eyes and then set it on fire. You can go temporarily blind. In the Ice Age, that meant death, so natural selection went to work, and according to the cold adaptation theory, it found an elegant solution. Make the eye opening narrower. Add extra fat deposits around the orbital bones. Create a structure that shields the eye from wind and reflected light, while still allowing sufficient vision for survival. The epicanthic fold does exactly this. It's a fold of skin that covers the inner corner of the eye, creating a narrower opening overall. In populations that have it, there's also typically more subcutaneous fat in the periorbital region. That's the tissue around the eye socket. This creates what looks like a puffier eyelid, but is actually a sophisticated insulation system. Think of it like built-in snow goggles, except instead of putting them on, you're born with them. The theory gets more compelling when you look at the distribution of these features. They're most common in populations whose ancestors lived in the coldest regions. Northeast Asians, Siberians, the Inuit and other Arctic peoples, native. Americans who crossed the Bering Land Bridge during glacial periods. All groups with documented histories in extreme cold environments. All groups showing high frequencies of epicanthic folds and related features. Some researchers have even tried to quantify the protective effect. Studies measuring wind resistance and light exposure suggest that narrower eye openings with epicanthic folds could reduce snow glare by 10 to 20% and significantly decrease the amount of freezing wind reaching the eye surface. In an environment where even small advantages mean the difference between surviving winter and not, that's huge. The fat deposits around the eyes serve another function too. Insulation. Your eyes are basically exposed brain tissue, incredibly vulnerable to temperature extremes. The blood vessels supplying them need to stay warm enough to function, or vision deteriorates rapidly. Extra fat around the orbital bones helps maintain stable temperatures even when ambient air is far below freezing. It's the same reason Arctic animals tend to be bulkier than their tropical cousins. More thermal mass equals better temperature regulation. There's also evidence from frost injury patterns. Historical medical records from Arctic and subarctic populations show that facial frostbite tends to affect certain areas first: the nose, the ears, the cheeks. But the eyes, even when other facial features were severely damaged, often remained functional. The structural protections built into the eye region were doing their job. For a long time, this theory seemed pretty airtight. Cold environment, cold adapted features, clear geographical correlation. Case closed, right? Not quite. Because science doesn't stop when we find a plausible explanation. Science keeps digging, keeps testing, keeps asking uncomfortable questions, and some uncomfortable questions started emerging. First, the timeline got complicated. Genetic studies suggest that the mutations associated with epicanthic folds might be older than the last glacial maximum, possibly dating back 30,000 or 40,000 years. That's before the coldest period, which raises questions about whether extreme cold was really the primary selection pressure. Second, the distribution isn't perfect. Some populations in extremely cold environments don't show these features. Certain Siberian groups, despite living in brutal conditions for thousands of years, have different eye structures. Meanwhile, some populations in relatively temperate regions do show epicanthic folds. If it's purely a cold adaptation, why the inconsistencies? Third, and this is the big one, we can't actually run the experiment. We can't take two genetically identical populations, expose one to Ice Age conditions and see if epicanthic folds evolve. Evolution works on timescales that make controlled experiments basically impossible. So we're left inferring causation from correlation, which is always tricky. Some researchers have proposed that the features might be adaptive for other reasons. Maybe the narrower eye opening and fat deposits protected against intense sunlight in general, not just snow glare. UV radiation is actually more intense at higher latitudes in summer than at the equator because of atmospheric conditions. Protection against this could be just as important as cold weather adaptation. Others suggest that the fat deposits around the eyes might be related to overall facial structure changes driven by dietary factors. Populations that relied heavily on tough frozen meat would have needed powerful jaw muscles. Changes in facial architecture to accommodate these muscles might have incidentally affected eye structure. The epicanthic fold could be a side effect rather than a direct adaptation. There's even speculation that these features emerge through genetic drift rather than selection. If small populations of early humans in Asia went through genetic bottlenecks, random mutations could have become common just by chance, not because they provided survival advantages. When populations later expanded, these random features expanded with them. But here's what we can say with confidence. Whether or not the Ice Age was the primary driver, populations in Northeast Asia did face extreme environmental challenges during the last glacial period. They did develop distinctive physical features that occur at high frequencies in their descendants, and those features do provide measurable protection against cold, wind, and intense light. The story might be more complicated than simple cold adaptation. Evolution usually is. Multiple factors probably contributed: temperature, UV radiation, diet, random genetic drift. Perhaps others we haven't even considered yet. But the fundamental reality remains. Your ancestors, if you carry these features, survived some of the harshest conditions humans have ever endured. They didn't just survive, they thrived, developing technologies and social systems sophisticated enough to hunt megafauna in frozen wastelands, build shelters that could withstand months of winter darkness, raise children in environments that should have been impossible for tropical primates. Every epicanthic fold, every subtle variation in eye structure is a reminder of that accomplishment. A reminder that humans can adapt to almost anything, that we've been testing our limits since the beginning, pushing into impossible places and finding ways to make them home. The Ice Age shaped us in ways we're still discovering. But it didn't defeat us. It made us stronger, more diverse, more capable. The frozen world tried to kill our ancestors. Instead, it forged them into survivors whose descendants would eventually populate the entire planet. But cold wasn't the only challenge they faced. Some populations were climbing, going higher than humans had ever gone before, adapting to thin air and blazing sun on the roof of the world. But maybe ice wasn't the only force shaping human eyes. Maybe there was another environment, equally harsh, equally demanding, that was selecting for the same adaptations through completely different pressures. Let's go up, way up, the Tibetan Plateau, 16,000 feet above sea level on average. Some areas reaching over 17,000 feet. An area the size of Western Europe, lifted by the collision of tectonic plates into a landscape so extreme that just breathing there can kill you if you're not adapted for it. They call it the roof of the world, and humans have been living there for at least 30,000 years, maybe longer. Picture yourself standing on that plateau 25,000 years ago. The air is so thin that every breath feels incomplete. Your lungs are working twice as hard to extract enough oxygen to keep your brain functioning. Your heart is pounding even when you're sitting still. This is what physiologists call chronic hypoxia, and it's killing you slowly with every passing day, unless you're adapted for it. But that's not the only problem. Look around. Snow and ice stretch to the horizon, reflecting sunlight with brutal intensity. The UV radiation at this altitude is 40% stronger than at sea level. There's less atmosphere to filter it out. Every photon of light that bounces off that pristine white landscape is trying to damage your eyes. Snow blindness isn't just uncomfortable up here. It's a death sentence. If you can't see, you can't hunt, you can't gather, you can't navigate, you die. Now add wind. Constant, relentless wind that picks up ice crystals and hurls them at your face like microscopic knives. The air is so dry that moisture evaporates from your eyes almost instantly. Tears freeze on your cheeks. Your corneas start to desiccate, becoming vulnerable to infection and scarring. This environment is actively hostile to large, exposed eyes. The kind of eyes that work perfectly fine in the humid lowlands of Africa or Southeast Asia become a liability up here. Natural selection doesn't care about aesthetics. It cares about survival. And up on the plateau, smaller eye openings weren't just an advantage, they were a necessity. The epicanthic fold, that layer of skin that covers the inner corner of the eye and creates the appearance of a smaller eye opening, it acts like built-in snow goggles. It reduces the amount of reflected light entering the eye. It protects against wind-driven ice crystals. It helps retain moisture around the eye surface. Most importantly, it reduces UV exposure to the delicate tissues of the eye. Think about traditional snow goggles worn by Arctic peoples. Inuit hunters carved narrow slits into pieces of wood or bone and wore them to prevent snow blindness. They were basically mimicking the same protective effect that epicanthic folds provide naturally. Evolution had created biological snow goggles, shaped over thousands of generations by the harsh realities of high-altitude life. But here's where it gets interesting. The Tibetan Plateau isn't the only place where humans face these challenges. Look at a topographic map of Central Asia. The Pamirs, the Tian Shan, the Altai Mountains, the Hindu Kush. This entire region is a landscape of high-altitude plateaus and mountain valleys, and humans have been moving through these territories for tens of thousands of years, not just staying on the plateau, but travelling across it, trading across it, eventually settling in the valleys and highlands throughout Central Asia. Every population that spent significant time at high altitude faced the same selection pressures: intense UV radiation, blinding snow reflection, dry cold air, wind-driven ice particles, and natural selection responded the same way every time: smaller palpebral fissures, more prominent epicanthic folds, additional fat padding around the eyes for insulation and protection. These adaptations didn't evolve in just one place. They evolved independently in multiple populations across the highlands of Asia, all responding to the same environmental challenges with the same anatomical solutions. Modern genetic studies support this. When researchers compare highland populations to lowland populations within the same ethnic groups, they find consistent differences. Tibetans living on the plateau have more pronounced epicanthic folds than their genetic relatives living in the lowlands of China. Mongolian populations from high-altitude regions show these features more strongly than Mongolians from lower elevations. The correlation between altitude and eye morphology is statistically significant even when controlling for other genetic factors. And it's not just about eye shape. High-altitude populations across Asia share a whole suite of adaptations that point to sustained evolutionary pressure from their environment. They have genetic variants that help them process oxygen more efficiently. Their bodies produce more red blood cells to carry what little oxygen is available. Their blood vessels are more elastic, allowing better circulation in cold conditions. These are the same Denisovan gene variants we talked about earlier, the ones that helped ancient humans colonize the highest inhabited places on Earth. This tells us something profound. The people who moved into high-altitude Central Asia weren't just visiting. They were living there for thousands of generations, long enough for natural selection to reshape their bodies, their blood chemistry, their eyes. These weren't temporary adaptations that could develop in a few generations. These were fundamental evolutionary changes that took tens of thousands of years to refine. But wait, doesn't this contradict the Ice Age theory? If eye shapes evolved as protection against cold and wind, and they also evolved as protection against high-altitude conditions, which one is right? Here's the thing, both are right. These theories don't compete. They complement each other, because the environments overlap. During the Ice Ages, the glaciers didn't just cover the poles, they advanced south into Central Asia, turning the already high-altitude landscape into an even more extreme environment. The Tibetan Plateau during the last glacial maximum would have been one of the most hostile environments on the planet. High altitude plus Ice Age conditions, thin air plus brutal cold, UV radiation plus snow reflection, plus sub-zero temperatures, plus relentless wind. Any human population trying to survive there would have faced every selection pressure we've discussed, all at once, all amplified by the interaction of altitude and latitude. Think about it geographically. Look at where populations with the most pronounced epicanthic folds live today. Northeast Asia, Mongolia, Siberia, Tibet, northern China, Korea. These aren't random locations. They form a coherent geographic pattern, a band across the northern latitudes of Asia, extending from the Arctic down into the highlands. These are the territories where Ice Age conditions and high-altitude conditions overlapped most dramatically, where cold and altitude combined to create selection pressures that were stronger than anywhere else on Earth. Populations that moved through these regions during the Ice Ages weren't just dealing with cold, they were dealing with altitude, and populations that lived at high altitude weren't just dealing with thin air, they were dealing with glacial conditions. The two environments reinforced each other, creating selection pressures that were more intense than either environment alone could produce. This is what biologists call synergistic selection. Multiple environmental factors working together to drive evolutionary change faster and more completely than any single factor could manage. And there's another piece of evidence that supports this combined theory. Modern populations show a gradient of eye morphology that correlates with both latitude and altitude. The most pronounced epicanthic folds appear in populations from high latitudes and high altitudes. As you move south and down in elevation, the features become gradually less pronounced. It's not an on-off switch, it's a continuum, exactly what you'd expect if multiple environmental factors were all contributing to the same adaptive outcome. But here's what's really fascinating. These adaptations didn't just protect against immediate environmental hazards, they had cascading effects on vision itself. Smaller eye openings changed the optical properties of the eye. They increased depth of field, making it easier to see clearly at multiple distances without refocusing. This would have been incredibly useful for high-altitude hunters trying to spot prey against snow-covered landscapes, or Ice Age humans scanning vast frozen plains for signs of game. The additional fat padding around the eyes also changes facial structure in ways that affect vision. It creates natural shading, reducing glare from above and the sides. It's like built-in sun visors, sculpted by evolution to optimize visual performance in bright reflective environments. Modern athletes who compete in snow sports often wear special eyewear to achieve the same effect. But ancient humans living at high altitudes developed it naturally. The epicanthic fold does something else too. It helps maintain the tear film across the eye surface. In dry, cold environments, this is critical. Tears aren't just for crying. They're a complex mixture of oils, water, and proteins that protect the cornea, nourish the eye surface, and defend against infection. In harsh conditions, maintaining a healthy tear film becomes challenging. The epicanthic fold helps by creating a microenvironment around the inner eye that's slightly warmer and more humid than the surrounding air. It's a tiny thing, but over the course of a lifetime it makes the difference between healthy eyes and chronic infections. So when we ask why Asian populations have distinctive eye shapes, the answer isn't simple. It's not just Ice Age adaptation. It's not just high-altitude adaptation. It's both, working together across thousands of generations. It's populations moving through the most extreme environments on Earth and being shaped by every challenge those environments presented. Cold and altitude, UV radiation and wind, snow blindness and desiccation. Every factor contributing, every generation refining, until the result was a suite of adaptations so effective that they became the dominant eye morphology across an entire continent. And those adaptations are still working today. Modern Tibetans living at high altitude have measurably lower rates of UV-related eye damage than lowlanders who move to the plateau. Their eyes are still doing exactly what evolution designed them to do, protecting against environmental extremes that would damage eyes without these built-in defenses. But the story doesn't end on the mountaintops. These high-altitude populations didn't stay isolated. They moved, they migrated, they spread across Asia, carrying their adaptive genes with them. And that movement, that great dispersal from the roof of the world down into the valleys and plains and coastlines of an entire continent, that's where our story goes next. So, picture yourself as part of a small group standing on the shores of northeast Africa, maybe 70,000 years ago. Behind you, generations of ancestors stretching back to those bottleneck survivors. Ahead of you, the narrow waters separating Africa from Arabia. Just a few miles of ocean, but it might as well be the edge of the world. Nobody in your lineage has ever crossed it. But the climate's changing again. Resources are getting scarce, and someone in your group says, let's see what's on the other side. That decision changed everything. The exodus from Africa wasn't a mass migration. It wasn't thousands of people marching out in organized columns. It was probably just a few dozen individuals, maybe even a single extended family group, who managed to cross into Arabia during a period when sea levels were lower and the strait was narrower. They were opportunists following game animals or fleeing competition, or maybe just curious about what lay beyond the horizon. But they carried with them the complete genetic toolkit of modern humanity. Every innovation, every adaptation, every survival skill refined over hundreds of thousands of years. They were the best of what Africa had produced. The descendants of survivors who had outlasted the bottleneck, the ice ages, the droughts, and every other disaster evolution could throw at them, and they were about to encounter a world already occupied by other human species. The first encounters probably happened in the Middle East, maybe around what is now Israel or Lebanon. Modern humans moving north and east out of Arabia, Neanderthals moving south from Europe. The archaeological record shows both species living in the same regions, sometimes even using the same cave systems, though probably not at exactly the same time. What happened when they met? We know they didn't just fight. The genetic evidence is clear on that point. They interbred. Modern humans and Neanderthals produced viable offspring, children who survived to adulthood and had children of their own. Today, everyone of non-African descent carries about 2% Neanderthal DNA, evidence of ancient mixing that happened multiple times across thousands of years, but they also competed, and modern humans had advantages. Not necessarily physical advantages. Neanderthals were stronger and possibly had larger brains. But modern humans seem to have had superior social organization, more sophisticated communication, better ability to maintain large cooperative networks. Over tens of thousands of years, this gave them the edge. Slowly, gradually, modern humans expanded while Neanderthal populations contracted. It wasn't genocide, it was demographic replacement, out-reproduction rather than extermination. But that's getting ahead of the story, because around 50,000 years ago, some of those modern humans who had settled in the Middle East started moving east, following river valleys, tracking animal herds, exploring new territories. They spread across southern Asia, hugging the coastlines where resources were abundant and travel was relatively easy. This wasn't slow migration. Recent genetic evidence suggests the initial expansion across Asia happened remarkably fast, maybe within just a few thousand years. Small groups leapfrogging along the coast, establishing new settlements every few generations, then sending out new pioneers who would do the same thing further east. By 45,000 years ago, modern humans had reached Southeast Asia. By 40,000 years ago, they had crossed open ocean to reach Australia, a journey that required sophisticated boat building and navigation. These weren't primitive savages stumbling around, hoping to find food. These were intelligent, innovative people capable of planning complex journeys and adapting to completely new environments. But the population that concerns us most, the one that would eventually develop the distinctive eye shape we started this whole journey trying to understand, took a different route. Instead of following the southern coastline, they turned north. Around 40,000 years ago, groups of modern humans began moving into what is now Central Asia and East Asia. This was harsh territory, cold, dry, with brutal winters and short growing seasons. But it was also relatively empty. The Neanderthals had mostly stayed in Europe and Western Asia. The Denisovans were there, though in smaller numbers, and again there was interbreeding. Modern East Asian populations carry more Denisovan DNA than populations anywhere else, evidence of mixing that happened as our ancestors moved into territories the Denisovans already occupied. But here's where population genetics gets really interesting. The groups moving into East Asia weren't large. We're probably talking about a few hundred individuals, maybe less, who made it through the initial colonization. They were pioneers, risk-takers, the people willing to leave behind relatively comfortable settlements on the southern coast to explore unknown territories further north. This created what geneticists call a founder effect. When a small group splits off from a larger population and establishes a new settlement in an isolated area, they carry only a subset of the genetic variation present in the parent population. It's like taking a handful of marbles from a jar full of different colours. Your handful might be randomly enriched for certain colours just by chance. Except with humans, it's not just chance. There's also selection. The environments these pioneers encountered were dramatically different from Africa or the southern Asian coastlines. Colder, drier, with intense sunlight reflecting off snow and ice. These conditions selected for specific adaptations, including changes to eye structure that we'll explore more deeply in other sections. But the founder effect meant that even neutral traits, characteristics that didn't necessarily help or hurt survival, could become widespread simply because they happened to be present in the founding population. Put 200 people in an isolated mountain valley, and whatever physical traits those 200 people have will become the standard traits for that population. Their descendants will look like them not because those traits are optimal, but because those are the only genes available. Between 40,000 and 20,000 years ago, these East Asian populations underwent explosive growth. They spread from their initial footholds in Central Asia across the entire eastern part of the continent, north into Siberia, where they developed the most extreme cold weather adaptations seen in any human population, south into what is now China and Southeast Asia, east toward the Pacific coast. Each expansion created new founder effects, new bottlenecks that refined and intensified whatever traits were present in the pioneering groups. Populations split, isolated by mountain ranges or climate barriers, evolved independently for thousands of years, then sometimes mixed again when climate changes opened new migration routes. The genetic signatures of these ancient movements are still visible today. Modern genetic studies can trace the relationships between different Asian populations, mapping out the family tree of human migration. The data shows clear patterns, populations expanding from Central Asia in multiple waves, adapting to local conditions, developing regional variations, but always maintaining genetic connections to their neighbours. By 20,000 years ago, humans had reached every habitable part of Asia, but they weren't done exploring. Some groups living in Northeast Asia, probably around what is now Siberia, kept pushing north and east, following the megafauna that thrived in the Ice Age tundra. Around 15,000 to 20,000 years ago, during the last glacial maximum when sea levels were at their lowest, these Siberian populations crossed the Bering Land Bridge into North America. Again, probably not many of them. Genetic analysis of Native American populations suggests they all descend from a relatively small founding group, maybe just a few hundred individuals who made it across and survived the harsh conditions on the other side. These first Americans carried with them the genetic heritage of their Asian ancestors, including many of the physical adaptations that had developed over tens of thousands of years in eastern North Asia. As they spread south through the Americas, reaching the southern tip of South America within just a few thousand years, they maintained those ancestral traits. This is why genetic studies show close relationships between East Asian and Native American populations. They're literally cousins, descendants of groups that split apart only 15,000 to 20,000 years ago, which is nothing in evolutionary terms. And here's what's remarkable about this entire migration story. It happened so fast. From the initial exit from Africa around 70,000 years ago to the settlement of South America by 15,000 years ago, modern humans had colonized every continent except Antarctica. In just 55,000 years, less than 3,000 generations, we went from being restricted to Africa to being a global species. Each stage of that expansion involved small groups carrying forward the traits of their ancestors while developing new adaptations to local conditions. The people who settled East Asia were the product of multiple founder effects, multiple selection events, multiple genetic bottlenecks that shaped their physical appearance and genetic makeup. But they were also connected by an unbroken chain of human migration and mixing that stretched back to Africa. The genetic evidence shows this clearly. Despite tens of thousands of years of separation, despite adapting to completely different environments, all human populations share the vast majority of their DNA. We're all remarkably similar genetically, which makes the physical differences between populations, including things like eye shape, even more interesting. Because they tell us about the power of evolution to create visible variation even when the underlying genetic differences are tiny, about how adaptation works in human populations, about the complex interplay between environment, genetics, and chance that shapes what we look like. Those early migrants into East Asia couldn't have known they were beginning an evolutionary experiment that would produce distinctive physical traits in their descendants. They were just trying to survive, find food, raise children in harsh and unfamiliar environments. But over hundreds of generations, the combination of founder effects, adaptation to extreme conditions, and random genetic drift created populations with distinctive characteristics, including changes to eye structure that would eventually become some of the most recognizable features of East Asian populations. The journey those pioneers took, from Africa to Arabia to Central Asia to the frozen reaches of Northeast Asia and beyond, set the stage for everything that would come after. Their survival in extreme environments would drive the adaptations we'll explore next. Natural selection wasn't the only force shaping human faces as populations spread across Asia. There was another evolutionary pressure working alongside environmental adaptation, something subtler but potentially just as powerful: sexual selection. The preference for certain features in potential mates, generation after generation, gradually transforming the appearance of entire populations. Charles Darwin figured this out in the 1870s. He noticed that natural selection, survival of the fittest, couldn't explain everything about how animals looked. Why did peacocks have those massive, impractical tails? Why did some deer grow antlers so large they could barely walk? These features didn't help survival. They actually made it harder. But they did one thing extremely well. They attracted mates. Darwin proposed that evolution work through two mechanisms: natural selection, which favoured traits that helped you survive, and sexual selection, which favoured traits that helped you reproduce. Sometimes these two forces pulled in opposite directions. The peacock's tail makes him more visible to predators, worse for survival, but it also makes him irresistible to females, better for reproduction. Over generations, sexual selection wins. Because it doesn't matter how good you are at surviving if nobody wants to mate with you. Now, human faces aren't peacock tails, but they're subject to the same evolutionary pressures. And here's where the story of Asian eye shapes gets really complicated. Because once your ancestors had adapted to cold climates or high altitudes or bright sunlight, developing epicanthic folds and flatter facial profiles, something else started happening. Those features became part of the cultural identity. They became markers of belonging, and quite possibly they became attractive. Picture this. You're living in Central Asia 25,000 years ago. Your people have been here for thousands of generations, long enough that everyone you've ever met has epicanthic folds, pronounced zygomatic arches, the full suite of cold-adapted facial features. Then you encounter someone from a different population, someone whose ancestors took a different migration route and developed different traits. Maybe their eyes are more deeply set. Maybe their nose is longer and narrower. Maybe their facial bone structure is completely different. Who do you choose as a mate? The person who looks like your family, your community, everyone you've ever known and trusted? Or the stranger with the unfamiliar face? For most people, throughout most of human history, the answer was obvious. You chose familiarity. You chose someone who looked like your people. This is called assortative mating, the tendency to select partners who resemble yourself and your community. It's not conscious. Nobody sat around thinking, I need to preserve our population's specific genetic traits. It's instinctive, driven by deep psychological preferences for the familiar and the culturally appropriate. But assortative mating has a powerful effect on evolution. It amplifies whatever traits are already present in a population. If everyone with epicanthic folds preferentially mates with others who have epicanthic folds, then the genes for those features become more concentrated, more pronounced, more universal with each generation. Not because those features help you survive the cold, though they might, but because they help you fit in, belong, attract a mate within your community. The archaeological evidence for this process is subtle but fascinating. Starting around 15,000 years ago, we see an explosion of representational art across Asia. Cave paintings, carved figurines, decorated tools. And when these ancient artists depicted human faces, they emphasized certain features. Large, prominent cheekbones, eyes rendered as simple lines or small openings, broad, flat facial planes. Now maybe they were just depicting reality, showing faces as they actually looked. But art isn't just documentation. It's also idealization. Artists emphasize the features they find important, beautiful, culturally significant. The fact that these artistic traditions consistently emphasize the same facial characteristics suggests those features carried meaning. They were markers of identity, possibly markers of attractiveness. By 10,000 years ago, we start seeing evidence of more complex beauty practices. Burial sites in ancient China contain ornaments designed to draw attention to specific facial features. Earrings that frame the face, headdresses that emphasize the breadth of the cheekbones. Later, much later, we get written records describing beauty standards. And while these records come from periods long after the initial evolution of Asian facial features, they might preserve echoes of much older preferences. Ancient Chinese texts describe ideal beauty in terms that sound familiar. Faces like the moon, meaning round and broad, willowy eyes, meaning narrow and elegant, high, prominent cheekbones. These aren't just arbitrary standards. They're descriptions of the facial features that had become predominant in East Asian populations through millennia of adaptation and cultural evolution. Japanese literature tells a similar story. The Tale of Genji, written over 1,000 years ago, describes ideal beauty in ways that emphasize epicanthic folds, small eyes, flat facial profiles. Korean historical records do the same. Across diverse Asian cultures, separated by geography and history, we find remarkably consistent beauty standards that happen to align with the facial features produced by cold adaptation. But here's the crucial question. Did sexual selection cause these features? Or did sexual selection simply preserve and amplify features that had already evolved through natural selection? The answer is probably both. In a complex feedback loop that lasted tens of thousands of years, here's how it might have worked. First wave, natural selection. Your ancestors migrated into cold environments. Those who happened to have slightly more subcutaneous facial fat, slightly more prominent zygomatic arches, slightly more epicanthic folds, they survived the cold better. Over hundreds of generations, these features became more common simply because they provided survival advantages. Second wave, cultural reinforcement. Those features became associated with your people, your community, the successful populations that had thrived in these challenging environments. They became markers of belonging. Art and oral traditions began emphasizing them. They appeared in stories about legendary ancestors, descriptions of cultural heroes, depictions of gods and spirits. Third wave, sexual selection. Now those features aren't just useful for survival, they're culturally valued, they're associated with strength, resilience, successful ancestry. People who have them more prominently become more attractive as potential mates, not because of any conscious decision, but because of deep cultural programming that associates these features with desirability. Fourth wave, amplification. Generations of assortative mating concentrate the genes for these features. What started as a subtle adaptation becomes more pronounced. The epicanthic folds become more universal. The zygomatic arches become more prominent. The overall facial architecture becomes more distinct. Over 20,000 years, these waves compound. Natural selection and sexual selection aren't competing. They're cooperating, both pushing in the same direction, creating facial features that are simultaneously adapted to the environment and shaped by cultural preferences. But untangling how much is natural selection and how much is sexual selection, that's nearly impossible, because they leave similar genetic signatures. A gene that increases in frequency because it helps you survive the cold looks a lot like a gene that increases in frequency because it makes you more attractive to potential mates. Both spread through the population, both become universal, both shape the way future generations look. Modern genetic studies have tried to separate these effects. They've found evidence for both. Certain genes related to facial structure show signs of natural selection, the kind of selective sweep you'd expect from environmental adaptation. But other genes, particularly those related to subtle variations in facial features, show patterns more consistent with sexual selection. Rapid changes that don't correlate neatly with climate or altitude. Changes that seem driven by cultural preferences rather than survival needs. The truth is, human evolution doesn't fit into neat categories. We're not just animals adapting to environments. We're cultural creatures who create our own selective pressures through art, ritual, mate preferences, and social hierarchies. Our ancestors weren't passive recipients of evolutionary forces. They were active participants, making choices about who to partner with, what features they found attractive, which characteristics they valued in their communities. Those choices had consequences. Over thousands of generations, they shaped faces, bodies, and even brains. The features we associate with different human populations aren't just products of climate and geography. They're also products of culture, aesthetics, and the accumulated weight of millions of individual mating decisions made over tens of thousands of years. And the feedback loop continues today. Modern beauty standards still emphasize features that have deep evolutionary roots. Cultural preferences still shape who people find attractive. Sexual selection still operates, though in more complex ways than our ancestors could have imagined. When you look at the diversity of human facial features across populations, you're not just seeing environmental adaptation. You're seeing the legacy of countless cultural traditions, aesthetic preferences, and mate selection decisions stretching back to the earliest days of human migration. You're seeing evolution guided not just by survival, but by desire. Not just by the harshness of Ice Age climates, but by the gentler, subtler force of what our ancestors found beautiful. And that's why the question of Asian eye shapes doesn't have a simple answer, because it's not one story, it's many stories, woven together over millennia. Stories of survival and adaptation, stories of culture and identity, stories of love and attraction, all of them true, all of them incomplete, all of them part of the vast complex tapestry of human evolution. But we're not done yet, because modern genetics has given us new tools to investigate these ancient questions, tools that can actually separate natural selection from sexual selection, tools that can trace the specific genes responsible for facial features back through time, and what they've discovered changes everything we thought we knew. Let's talk about what happens when scientists stop theorizing and start sequencing DNA. Because in the last 20 years, geneticists have cracked open the human genome and found something remarkable. They found the specific genetic changes that influenced East Asian physical features, including eye shape. And the story those genes tell is wilder than anyone expected. The breakthrough came in 2008. A team of researchers led by Pardis Sabeti at Harvard was studying a gene called EDR. That stands for ectodisplasina receptor, which sounds like something from a science fiction novel, but it's actually one of the most fascinating genes in the human genome. EDR codes for a protein involved in the development of ectodermal structures. That's fancy genetic speak for all the stuff that develops from the outer layer of a growing embryo. Hair, teeth, sweat glands, fingernails, and yes, the tissues around the eyes. Now here's where it gets interesting. The research team found that most humans carry what we'll call the ancestral version of EDA. This is the original, the version that's been around for millions of years, the version that our pre-human ancestors had. But East Asian populations carry something different. A variant called EDA 370A. One tiny change, a single nucleotide substitution in a gene thousands of letters long. One letter in the genetic alphabet swapped for another. And that one change influences multiple physical characteristics simultaneously. People with the 370A variant tend to have thicker hair shafts, individual hairs that are literally wider in diameter than those of people with the ancestral variant. They tend to have more shovel-shaped incisors, teeth with a distinctive scoop on the inner surface that's relatively rare in other populations. They tend to have more numerous and more active eccrine sweat glands, the glands that produce watery sweat for temperature regulation, and they tend to have increased fatty tissue in the upper eyelid, which contributes to what we recognize as the epicanthic fold. One gene, multiple effects. This is what geneticists call pleiotropy, when a single genetic variant influences multiple seemingly unrelated traits. It's like finding a master switch that controls several different lights in a house. Flip it one way, and you get one combination of features. Flip it the other way, and you get a different combination. But here's what makes EDAR 370A really special. It's not just present in East Asian populations, it's nearly universal. Studies show that roughly 90 to 95% of Han Chinese carry this variant. Similar frequencies appear in Korean, Japanese, Mongolian, and Native American populations. This isn't a rare mutation that shows up occasionally. This is a defining characteristic of East Asian ancestry. That kind of frequency distribution tells geneticists something important. When a genetic variant reaches such high prevalence in a population, it usually means one of two things. Either it happened a very long time ago in a small founding population and spread through genetic drift, or it provided some kind of advantage that natural selection favored strongly enough to drive it to high frequency relatively quickly. The researchers did the math, using multiple methods of analysis, comparing genetic sequences from populations around the world, building evolutionary models to track how mutations spread through populations over time. They arrived at an estimate. The EDAR 370A variant probably arose somewhere between 30,000 and 35,000 years ago, right in the middle of the last ice age, right when ancestral East Asian populations were spreading across the continent, adapting to new environments, facing new challenges. But was it selected for? Did it actually provide an advantage? Or did it just happen to be present in a small founding population and spread through random chance? The genetic signatures suggest strong positive selection. The 370A variant shows what's called a selective sweep, a pattern where the variant and surrounding genetic regions spread through the population faster than would be expected by chance alone. Something about this variant made people who carried it more likely to survive and reproduce. What that advantage was remains hotly debated. The thicker hair might have provided better insulation in cold climates. The increased sweat gland density might have helped with temperature regulation. The shovel-shaped incisors might have been useful for processing certain foods or working with materials. Or maybe the advantage wasn't any single trait, but the combination. Maybe having all these features together provided some benefit we haven't fully understood yet. And here's where the story gets more complex. Because while EDAR 370A is important, it's not the whole story. Eye shape, like most physical traits, is what geneticists call polygenic. That means it's influenced by multiple genes, possibly dozens, each contributing a small effect. EDAR 370A is just the one we've identified most clearly, the one with the biggest effect, the one that's easiest to track through genetic analysis. Genome-wide association studies, where researchers compare DNA from thousands of individuals to find genetic variants associated with specific traits, have identified several other genes that influence eyelid structure and eye shape. Some affect the development of facial bone structure, which indirectly influences how the soft tissues around the eyes are positioned. Others affect the distribution of fat deposits in the face. Still others influence the development of the eyelid itself during embryonic growth. Each of these genes contributes a small piece to the final picture. You inherit one version from your mother, another from your father, and the combination determines your specific eye shape. This is why there's so much variation even within populations. Two people with East Asian ancestry might both carry EDAR 370A, but differ in dozens of other relevant genes, producing distinctly different eye shapes. Modern genetic studies have also revealed something profound about East Asian population history. When researchers sequence genomes from people across Asia and compare them to populations from other continents, they find evidence of complex migration patterns and population mixing going back tens of thousands of years. The data suggest that ancestral East Asian populations went through at least one major population bottleneck between 50,000 and 30,000 years ago, separate from the much earlier bottleneck that affected all humans. This later bottleneck, possibly triggered by the harsh conditions of the last glacial maximum, reduced population sizes dramatically. Small groups of survivors, scattered across refuge areas, maintained enough genetic diversity to recover, but the bottleneck created opportunities for genetic drift to operate powerfully. After the bottleneck, when populations expanded again, certain genetic variants that might have been rare before became common, spread by a combination of selection and founder effects. EDAR 370A was probably one of these. Present at low frequency in the ancestral population, it became common after the bottleneck, either because it provided advantages in the post-bottleneck environment, or because it happened to be present in high frequency in the small groups that survived and later expanded. Genome-wide studies have also revealed extensive gene flow between different Asian populations. Ancient DNA from archaeological sites shows that populations were mixing, separating, and remixing over thousands of years. Groups adapted to northern cold climates would occasionally mix with groups adapted to southern tropical environments. Highland populations would trade genes with lowland populations. This created a complex tapestry of genetic variation across the continent. What's fascinating is that despite all this mixing, EDAR 370A and associated traits remained remarkably stable across most East Asian populations. This suggests either that the variant provided consistent advantages across multiple environments, or that it became so common early in East Asian population history that it persisted through all the subsequent migrations and mixing events. Recent studies have even found that DAR influences more than just physical features. Experiments with mice engineered to carry the human 370A variant show differences in mammary gland development. This has led some researchers to speculate that the variant might have influenced reproductive success in ways we're only beginning to understand. Maybe women with the variant were slightly more successful at nursing infants, providing a selective advantage that had nothing to do with climate or eye protection. The truth is, despite all our genetic sequencing and computational modelling, we still don't know the full story. Research continues. Every year, new studies identify additional genetic variants associated with facial features. Better statistical methods let researchers tease apart the relative contributions of different genes. Ancient DNA from archaeological sites reveals how these variants were distributed in the past, helping us reconstruct their evolutionary history. What's clear is that eye shape, like every human physical characteristic, results from a complex interplay of genetics and evolution. It's not simple, it's not determined by any single cause. It's the product of thousands of generations of adaptation, migration, population mixing and genetic drift. EDAR 370A is an important piece of the puzzle, but it's just one piece among many. And here's something worth pondering as you drift off tonight. That variant you carry, whatever variants they are, whatever combination of genes shapes your eyes, your hair, your face, they're all evidence of your ancestors' journeys. Every gene is a historical record, a molecular fossil that traces back through thousands of generations. The EDAR variant that influences East Asian eye shapes arose roughly 30,000 years ago, which means it's been passed down through approximately 1,500 generations, from parent to child to grandchild, through ice ages and migrations, through the rise and fall of countless societies, surviving wars and plagues and famines to reach you today. Your genome is an archive, and scientists are still learning to read it, still discovering what stories it tells about where we came from and how we became who we are. The genetics of eye shape is just one chapter in a much longer story, one that we're only beginning to understand. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine you're looking at a map of the world from far above. The ice sheets are growing and shrinking. Deserts breathe in and out like living things. Forests spread, then retreat. Now imagine tiny human groups scattered across that changing planet. Not millions of people in megacities, but little bands of 20, 30, maybe 50 individuals. Each group is dealing with its own local version of the same basic problem. How do you keep a warm, wet, fragile eyeball working in a world that's trying to freeze it, dry it out, sandblast it, or burn it with sunlight? We often talk about Asian eyes as if that's where the story starts and ends. It doesn't. The same basic eye features people like to point out in East Asia exist in other places too, far away, among people who share no recent common history. That's the first hint that something deeper is going on. Let's start in a place most people never think about when they imagine small eyes: Southern Africa. Picture the Kalahari at sunrise. The air is cool, but the light is already harsh. The ground is bright, almost white in places. Dust is everywhere, fine as flour, lifted by every step, every gust of wind. Here live the Khoisan peoples, one of the most ancient lineages on Earth. Their DNA preserves echoes of human history that go back hundreds of thousands of years. When you look at many Khoisan faces, you'll notice something striking. A lid shape that, to a casual observer, looks a lot like what people stereotype as Asian eyes. A partial epicanthic fold, a bit of extra skin at the inner corner of the eye, a narrower visible opening. Not identical to East Asians, but similar enough that early European anthropologists were confused by it. They invented strange stories to explain it. Maybe there had been mysterious migrations from Asia. Maybe they were some kind of mixed race. They were trying to force Khoisan faces into a story that centered Europe and Asia. But genetics tells a simpler story. Khoisan are not recent arrivals. They're not an offshoot of anyone else. They're one of the oldest continuous human populations on the planet. Their eye shape didn't come from Asia. It arose right there, under African skies. Why? Think about that environment. Intense sunlight bouncing off pale, sandy ground. Huge temperature swings between cool nights and scorching days. Dry winds that lift dust and sand, blowing directly into your face. Under those conditions, any subtle change that protects the eye surface, that helps conserve moisture, that shields against glare, gets rewarded. Over thousands of generations, small variations add up. Slightly narrower palpebral fissures, a bit more fat in the upper eyelid, a soft fold of skin that changes how light enters, how tears evaporate, how dust gets deflected. You're looking at convergent evolution in action. Different place, different history, same kind of solution. Now let's move halfway around the planet, cross the Red Sea, skim over India, glide above Southeast Asia, then out across a land bridge that no longer exists, the Bering Land Bridge. During the last ice age, sea levels were lower. Siberia and Alaska were connected by a cold, windy corridor of steppe and tundra. It wasn't a pleasant place. Snow, ice crystals, and razor-sharp winds. Glare from snowfields that could burn your retinas. Cold air that could freeze exposed tissue. Small groups of humans pushed through that corridor anyway. They were descendants of East Asian populations already carrying some of the eye traits we associate with that region. Higher frequency of epicanthic folds, more orbital fat, subtly narrower openings. When they crossed into the Americas and spread south, they carried those traits with them. Over thousands of years, those lineages became the ancestors of the indigenous peoples of the Americas. Look at photos, or better yet, meet people in real life from Inuit communities, from First Nations in Canada, from native groups in the United States, from the Andes, from the Amazon. You'll see an extraordinary range of faces. Tall noses, flat noses, round faces, long faces, and a rich variety of eye shapes. Some have very prominent epicanthic folds. Some have almost none. Some lids look very East Asian to the casual eye. Others wouldn't fit that stereotype at all. Why such diversity? Because once those first migrants reached the Americas, they weren't all living in one giant snowfield. They spread into deserts, high mountains, tropical rainforests, prairies, icy coasts. Every environment supplied its own set of pressures. In the far north, among Inuit and related Arctic peoples, you again find a high frequency of narrower eye openings and folds. Here, like in Ice Age Siberia, snow glare and wind-driven ice are constant threats. Layers of fat around the eyes help insulate delicate tissues from the cold. Lid shapes that reduce exposed surface area help protect against evaporation and injury. But go deep into the rainforest, where light is filtered through leaves and humidity is high, and those same pressures aren't as intense. In some groups the traits persist, in others they soften. Selection shifts its focus. Other features become more important. Same ancestral toolkit, different local edits. Now drift north again, but this time in Eurasia. slide up through forests and across bogs into a land of low winter sun and endless snow. Scandinavia, home of the Sami. The Sami are an indigenous people of northern Fennoscandia, Norway, Sweden, Finland and parts of Russia. They've herded reindeer, fished icy rivers, and followed the migrations of animals through some of the harshest winters on Earth. Step outside during a polar winter storm and you'll understand their world. Snow doesn't just fall, it flies sideways. Ice crystals driven by wind scour exposed skin. The ground is a sheet of white, bouncing light straight into your eyes even when the sun barely peeks over the horizon. Sami faces show a blend of European and more Eastern features, reflecting complex ancient migrations. Some individuals have eye shapes that, again, echo the same theme. Slightly narrower openings, soft folds, subtle adaptations for a life spent squinting into wind, light and snow. Are Sami Asian? No, they're Sami. Their history is their own, but the environment they inhabit rhymes with the environments of other cold-adapted peoples. And once again, you see something like convergent evolution, different ancestral populations, different migration routes, similar eye region solutions to the same physical problems, eye shapes that can help with reducing heat loss from the face, protecting the cornea from freezing winds, minimizing damage from bright reflected light. Yet, here's where it gets even more interesting. Similar environments don't always produce the same visible adaptations. Think of northern Europeans in general. Plenty of them live in snowy, cold regions too. But most don't have pronounced epicanthic folds. Their eye shapes cover a wide range, often with large open lids. Why? Because natural selection never works from scratch. It works with what's already there. Take two populations. Put them in roughly similar climates. You won't necessarily get the same visible traits because they start from different genetic baselines. One population might have more variation in eyelid thickness, another might have more variation in pigmentation, or in nose shape, or in tear chemistry. Each group's evolutionary solution to cold and glare might emphasize different pieces of anatomy. One might evolve more orbital fat and a subtle fold. Another might evolve changes in tear film composition, different blinking rates, or just cultural habits like using hoods, goggles and veils more often. And some adaptations are practically invisible to us. We notice the dramatic stuff, eye shape, skin colour, hair texture. But a lot of adaptation happens in ways you don't see by just looking at a face. Tiny tweaks in how blood vessels constrict in the cold, changes in how the immune system responds to local microbes, shifts in metabolism that affect how quickly you burn fat. Two populations can both be extremely well adapted to similar environments, and yet look quite different on the surface. This is where the idea of convergent evolution becomes powerful. Convergent evolution is when different species or different populations independently evolve similar traits because they face similar problems. Think of wings in birds and bats. Think of streamlined bodies in dolphins and sharks. In humans, convergent evolution shows up in more subtle ways. The ability to digest lactose in adulthood evolved multiple times in different pastoralist societies. High-altitude adaptations appear in Tibetans, Andeans and Ethiopian highlanders, but via different genetic paths. Eye shape is part of that story. Epicanthic folds, thicker eyelids, narrower openings. These seem to have arisen multiple times or been maintained and accentuated in multiple lineages in response to extreme cold, high glare from snow or sand, dry windy conditions, possibly high UV environments where squinting and lid shape help protect internal eye structures, the Khoisan in southern Africa, Arctic and subarctic peoples in Eurasia and the Americas, some Central Asian groups, Sami populations in northern Europe, East Asians whose ancestors weathered the cold, windy plains of Ice Age North Asia. Different threads, similar patterns. Pull back again and look at the whole globe in your mind. Those 1,280 ancient survivors you met earlier in the story. Their descendants fan out across every continent except Antarctica. They walk into deserts, jungles, mountains, and frozen coasts. They face sandstorms, blizzards, monsoons, and blinding sun. Everywhere they go, evolution is quietly, patiently adjusting the dials. A little more fat here, a little less pigment there, a curve of cartilage, a fold of skin, a shift in how tissues develop. Eye shape is one of the most visible reminders that our faces are maps of our ancestors' environments. Not rankings, not hierarchies, not beauty standards written into bone, just solutions. Different answers to the same basic question. How do you keep seeing clearly in a world that's constantly trying to damage your eyes? When you walk through a modern city, you're seeing the results of those ancient experiments all around you. An East Asian commuter, a Khoisan descendant in southern Africa, a Sami herder in the far north, a Quechua farmer in the Andes, a Nigerian student, a Swedish teacher, a Navajo artist, all carrying slightly different versions of the same evolutionary toolkit. All of them descended from the same tiny, desperate population that once clung to survival in a changing Africa. The diversity of eye shapes on our planet isn't evidence that we are fundamentally separate kinds of humans. It's evidence of how flexible one single species can be. We stretch from the equator to the polar seas. We live at sea level and at altitudes where most mammals would struggle to breathe. We endure deserts, monsoon forests, ice shelves, and cities lit up brighter than any natural sky. Through all of that, our eyes have had to keep working, so our bodies have adapted again and again in parallel along different paths that sometimes meet, sometimes diverge. When you look into another person's eyes, you are seeing more than a colour, more than a shape. You're looking at the history of their ancestors' climate, light and landscape, written in muscle and skin. And if you could see your own face with that same quiet, evolutionary awareness, you'd recognize something profound. Every lid, every fold, every angle is a record of survival. Proof that your lineage, like all others, found a way to keep seeing, no matter what the world threw at it. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine walking through time instead of space. Not across savannas or ice sheets this time, but through galleries, temples, palaces, and crowded city streets. Because while evolution was busy shaping eyelids and tear, ducts, culture was busy shaping something just as powerful and sometimes much more dangerous, meaning. An eye is never just an eye in human societies. It's a symbol, a story, a mirror people use to decide who belongs and who doesn't. So let's step quietly into one of those galleries. Ancient China. A scroll unrolls in front of you, the ink still almost glistening in your imagination. Look closely at the faces. The eyes aren't hyper-detailed, photorealistic windows. They're lines, strokes, suggestions. A calm downward curve, a gentle arc beneath the brow. Painters weren't obsessed with reproducing exact anatomy. They were trying to capture spirit, character, inner life. In traditional Chinese portraiture, eyes were often depicted as long, narrow shapes, slightly elongated, sometimes just a few brush strokes. Not because artists thought Asians have small eyes, but because that was the visual language they developed. Just as written characters compress entire ideas into a few strokes, painted eyes distilled expression into elegant simplicity. What mattered was shen, spirit, vitality, not iris diameter. Move forward a bit into the world of classical Chinese beauty ideals. Poets described eyes as autumn water, crescent moons, long as willow leaves. The emphasis was on softness, calmness, a quiet depth of feeling. The eye could be modest, half-lidded, veiled. Restraint itself was beautiful. No one was measuring eyelid folds with a ruler. They were measuring grace. Now let the scene dissolve and reform in Japan. Wooden prints, ukiyo-e, the floating world, kabuki actors with dramatic eyeliner, courtesans with eyes shaped and shaded into bold dark ovals. Again, stylization rules. Eyes became symbols of emotion and role. A warrior's eyes, fierce, angular, wide with intensity. A noblewoman's, controlled, slightly downcast, serene. Traditional Japanese aesthetics prized what they called shibui and yugen, subtlety, mystery, depth beneath the surface. A slight downturn at the corner of the eye could make a character look thoughtful, refined, unworldly. Beauty wasn't a single fixed shape. It was the mood the eye seemed to carry. Shift again, this time to the Korean peninsula. In the royal portraits of the Joseon dynasty, faces are calm, symmetrical, composed. The eyes? Narrow, steady, almost meditative. Confucian ideals dominated art and life. Modesty, self-control, harmony, loud expression, exaggerated emotion, big theatrical eyes. Those belonged on the stage, not in the moral ideal. In everyday life, traditional Korean beauty ideals often celebrated a kind of gentle, natural look. Smooth skin, balanced features, eyes that looked sincere more than spectacular. Folk paintings, court portraits, religious art. They all repeated the same quiet message. The eye reveals character, not just beauty. For thousands of years across East Asia, eye shape was something lived, drawn, sung about, but rarely dissected. It was part of a whole face, a whole person, a whole cultural world. Nobody thought they were walking around with small eyes. They just had eyes, the same way people in Europe had noses without thinking of them as European noses. But then the river of history curved into a darker valley. The age of Western colonial expansion brought cannons, railroads, missionaries, and cameras, sketchbooks, and racial theories. European scientists and travellers arrived with measuring tools and preconceptions. They weren't just seeing faces, they were ranking them. In the 18th and 19th centuries, Western thinkers built elaborate, deeply flawed systems to classify humans into races. They measured skulls, noses, jaws, and yes, eyes. They tried to turn living complex people into data points on a hierarchy with themselves neatly on top. Asian eye shapes, especially the epicanthic fold, became one more marker to file into these pseudo-scientific cabinets. Artists and cartoonists in Europe and America began exaggerating these differences, narrowing eyes, slanting them sharply upward, stripping them of depth and individuality. The subtle stylizations of Asian art were replaced in Western imaginations with crude caricatures. An eye that had once symbolized serenity or wisdom in one culture became, in another, a sign of otherness, something to mock or fear. These images seeped into advertising, films, political propaganda. Stereotypes hardened. Small eyes became shorthand for alien, inscrutable, cold, unemotional, words that had nothing to do with anatomy and everything to do with power. This was not evolution at work. This was culture using biology as a weapon. The same eyelid fold that might once have helped someone's ancestors cope with snow glare or biting wind was now recast as a visual label separating us from them. But history doesn't move in one direction. Cultures don't just receive impressions, they respond. As Asia modernized and globalized, beauty standards shifted and multiplied. In late imperial China and Meiji-era Japan, Western influence brought new fashions, new hairstyles, New technologies like photography. Faces that once lived only in brush and ink became subjects of studio portraits and magazine covers. Eyes could now be examined, compared, idealized in new ways. In the 20th century, especially after World War II, Western media flooded Asian markets. Hollywood films, fashion magazines, pop idols. Big round eyes framed by heavy lashes started to symbolize glamour, modernity, international appeal. Some people in East Asia began to see their own natural eye shapes through this imported lens and feel, often painfully, that they came up short. In cities from Tokyo to Seoul to Shanghai, cosmetic practices exploded. Eyelid tape, makeup techniques to open the eye, and eventually double eyelid surgery. These weren't simply people wanting to look white. The reality was more tangled. Many sought what they perceived as a brighter, more awake, more camera-friendly look, a hybridized beauty ideal emerging from both local and global influences. Still, the underlying message could bite. There is a better eye, and it might not be the one you were born with. At the same time, Asian media were creating their own stars, their own definitions of beauty. K-drama leads with soft monolid eyes, J-pop idols with a mix of folds and creases, Chinese actresses with elegant, elongated eyes that echoed classical paintings. Beauty wasn't a straight line marching toward a single Western standard. It was a swirling, sometimes conflicting set of preferences, migrating through time like the genes that shape the eyes in the first place. Now shift the scene to the present. A crowded subway in any major global city. Different faces, different eye shapes, all reflected in the glass of a smartphone screen. Online, conversations about eye shape and identity are unfolding at a scale our ancestors couldn't have imagined. Some people reclaim what was once mocked. They celebrate monolids, post selfies with hashtags that turn old slurs upside down, share makeup tutorials that highlight rather than hide their natural shapes. Others wrestle with internalized ideals, wondering how much of what they want to change in their appearance is truly their desire, and how much has been planted there by centuries of bias. In diasporic communities, Asian families living in Europe, the Americas, Australia, eye shape can become a focal point of belonging and difference. A child might hear comments at school about their small eyes and then go home to grandparents who see those same eyes as a precious link to their own parents and grandparents before them. In that moment, an eyelid isn't just cartilage and skin, it's heritage, and it's a battleground. This is where understanding our evolutionary history becomes more than a curiosity. If you know that eye shapes around the world are the results of populations adapting in tiny increments to cold winds, bright snow, desert glare, high altitudes, or simply genetic drift, it becomes harder to see any one form as inherently superior or inferior. The stereotype of small Asian eyes starts to unravel when you learn that epicanthic folds appear in many populations, from the Arctic to parts of Africa, arising again and again like a recurring solution to similar environmental challenges. But knowledge alone isn't enough. We have to be careful how we use it. It's tempting to reach for simple stories. Asians have this eye shape because of the Ice Age. Full stop. But real evolution is messy. Multiple pressures, overlapping histories, accidents frozen into place by time. When we talk about adaptation, we're not defining a people by a single trait. We're tracing one tiny thread in a huge tangled tapestry. The goal isn't to say this group has different eyes because of X, therefore they are Y. The goal is to marvel at how many different ways there are to be human, and how every one of those ways carries the imprint of survival against impossible odds. Think back to those 1,280 bottleneck survivors scattered across Africa, their descendants fanning out into ice and forest, mountain and coastline. They weren't thinking about Asian eyes or European eyes. They were just trying to keep fire lit, children fed, stories remembered. Over tens of thousands of years as their descendants face snowstorms, sandstorms, monsoon glare and high-altitude sun, subtle shifts accumulated around the eyes. Folds, fat pads, socket shapes, pigmentation. Later, when art and poetry emerged, people looked into each other's eyes and found metaphors: moonlight, autumn water, willow leaves. Later still, when Empire and Prejudice arrived, some of those same eyes became targets of mockery or fear. And now, in an age of DNA tests and global media, we're trying to unlearn those distortions and see ourselves and each other more clearly. If you trace the path of an eyelid fold from a Neanderthal sheltering in a frozen valley, to a Denisovan scaling a high plateau, to a farmer in ancient China bent over a rice field, to a commuter on a late-night train scrolling through videos, you start to see the bigger pattern. Every eye shape on this planet is a fossil and a prophecy at the same time. A fossil of what our ancestors endured, a prophecy that their descendants would still be here, looking back. So as you lie there, perhaps feeling your own eyelids grow heavier, remember this. There is no small or big in any meaningful moral sense when it comes to eyes. There is only variation, carved by climate and chance, embroidered by culture, distorted by prejudice, and now slowly being reclaimed. Every gaze from every corner of the world carries the same ancient story underneath. We survived. We adapted. We kept going. And when you imagine those countless faces across history, painted on scrolls, carved into wood blocks, captured in photographs, glowing on screens, all of them looking out at a world they were still learning to understand, you're seeing not difference, but continuity. A single species experimenting with 1,000 ways of being, 1,000 ways of seeing. We are all part of that experiment, all part of that story, all carrying in the shapes of our eyes quiet evidence of an incredible journey that is still unfolding. The farther back you follow this story, the clearer something becomes. There is no single moment where Asian eyes suddenly appear. No one tribe huddled in a snowy cave and woke up a few generations later with epicanthic folds and narrower eye openings. No ancient engineer sat down and designed a perfect cold weather face. Instead, what we see is the same pattern that shaped everything else about us. Small changes, repeated trials, environments pushing, genetics nudging, culture steering, chance rolling the dice over and over again. When you put all the theories side by side, the Ice Age winters, the high-altitude sun, the blowing dust of open plains, the genetics of face shape, the quiet pull of beauty standards, a different picture comes into focus. Eye shape isn't a single adaptation with a single purpose, it's a tapestry. Some threads are environmental, shielding the surface of the eye from blinding snow glare, stinging wind, and tiny shards of ice or dust, thickening the fat in the eyelids for insulation, adjusting the angle of the orbit and the way the eyelids drape across it to balance protection with field of view. Other threads are genetic drift. When small groups split off from larger populations and wander into new lands, random traits can become common simply because of who happens to be in the group. A slightly fuller upper eyelid here, a different fold there. Nothing dramatic at first, just subtle variations, repeated over many generations until they feel like a signature. And then there is sexual selection, the slow, gentle force of preference. People choosing partners who feel familiar or who embody the stories a culture tells about beauty, strength, and identity. In one valley, a rounder eye might become the ideal. In another, a softer fold, a particular tilt. Those choices echo forward through time, reshaping faces just as surely as any glacier or monsoon. When you combine all of these, cold, altitude, dust, drift, and desire. You don't get a neat, tidy answer. You get something more interesting. You get us. Because the so-called Asian eye isn't one thing, and it isn't limited to Asia. Versions of the epicanthic fold appear in indigenous groups from the Arctic to the Americas, in some African populations, in scattered places where similar pressures may have nudged similar solutions. Parallel adaptations, unfolding in different corners of the world as if evolution kept discovering the same general trick. Protect the eye, streamline the face, conserve warmth, regulate light. It's the same basic story that played out after the Great Bottleneck. One species, three branches, modern humans, Neanderthals, Denisovans, each facing its own set of challenges, each sculpted by cold, heat, hunger, altitude, pathogens, and the constant demand to find food, raise children, and stay alive. The details changed from place to place. The rules did not. Where winters were brutal and the wind never stopped, bodies became stockier, noses broader or taller, sinuses deeper, eyelids heavier. Where forests were dense and the air was wet and warm, different solutions emerged. Taller, leaner bodies, different skin chemistry, different hair, different patterns of fat and muscle. Eye shape is just one tiny part of that larger adaptive choreography. A single note in an immense, ongoing song. And this is why there isn't one true answer, no single theory that wins. The Ice Age matters, high altitudes matter, dry continental interiors matter, cultural ideals of beauty matter, random chance matters. Take anyone away and the pattern shifts. Keep them all, and our faces begin to make sense. When you look in the mirror, you're not seeing a finished design. You're seeing a living record, a layered archive of problems solved and danger survived. Your eyelids, your lashes, the way the skin folds when you smile. These are fossils written in flesh, carrying information about storms your ancestors endured, landscapes they crossed, choices they made about who to love and who to trust. For some, those ancestors trekked across frozen steppes, their faces stung by ice-laden winds. For others, they climbed into thin, bright air on Himalayan plateaus or Andean ridges, where the sun is harsher and the sky feels closer. For still others, they moved through dense equatorial forests, where sharp shafts of light broke through leaves, and insects were more dangerous than frostbite. Different journeys, different pressures, different solutions, but all of it, still, one story. And that's the bigger picture that Eye Shape quietly points to. Human diversity is not a catalogue of separate kinds. It's the visible surface of a single shared process. Evolution learning, experimenting, exploring what is possible for a hairless primate standing upright on a changing planet. The variety of human faces is evidence of our resilience. It shows how flexible our species is, how many ways there are to be well adapted. In one region, having a slightly narrower palpebral fissure, the opening between the eyelids, might protect against glare and dryness. In another, a wider opening and less overlying tissue might be perfectly fine or even advantageous. Both are successful, both work, and both are human. This matters because our brains are wired to notice small differences, the angle of an eyelid, the width of a nose, the colour and texture of hair. For most of our history, these tiny cues helped us guess where someone came from, who they might be related to, which group they belonged to in a world of scattered bands and small tribes. In the modern world, those same instincts can easily turn into stereotypes and hierarchies, stories that say some traits are superior, others inferior. Some faces normal, others strange. Evolution tells a different story. From an evolutionary perspective, there is no superior eye shape. There are only traits that worked well enough, long enough, in specific places, under specific conditions to be passed down. The heavy lid of an Inuit hunter, the deep-set eyes of a Highlander, the wide, round eyes of a tropical forager, they're all success stories. They all represent lineages that made it through ice ages, droughts, epidemics, and famines. Every face you see in a crowded city street is proof of survival. And when you step back far enough, the differences start to blur. The features that felt so sharp and defining, a fold, a tilt, an angle, shrink in importance compared to what we share. The same fused chromosome, inherited from the survivors of that ancient bottleneck, the same basic brain architecture that allows language, memory, and imagination, the same hands capable of shaping stone, weaving cloth, typing messages in the dark, the same need for connection, for story, for belonging. Eye shape, in this sense, is a doorway. You start by asking why one group looks a certain way. You end up walking through 900,000 years of climate chaos, migration, interbreeding, and innovation, until the boundary lines between us and them feel more like pencil marks on water than rigid walls, and we're still learning. New genetic techniques are constantly revising the details. Ancient DNA scraped from a tooth in a Siberian cave suddenly reveals a new branch of Denisovan ancestry. A fragment of skull from the Tibetan plateau forces us to rethink when high-altitude adaptations evolved. A better model of solar radiation shows how UV exposure and snow glare really shape eyes and skin over tens of thousands of years. Future research will likely uncover even more subtle contributors, tiny regulatory genes that affect how eyelid tissues grow in the womb, interactions between diet, climate, and facial development, unexpected episodes of interbreeding with now extinct groups that left delicate signatures in the bones around our eyes. If we could look ahead another 100 years, the story we're telling tonight would probably seem incomplete, maybe even naive in places. But that's part of the beauty. We're not just descendants of survivors, we're descendants of question askers, of people who sat around fires wondering why the people over the mountain looked different, why their eyes caught the light in another way, what that might mean. You are part of that same long chain of curiosity, and as we learn more, something interesting happens inside us. The more details we discover about how human variation arose, about how environment and chance and culture dance together, the harder it becomes to cling to simple categories: Asian, European, African, American. Under the microscope of deep time, these labels melt. They're recent, superficial, the rough shorthand of a species that only just stepped out of its small scattered bands into global civilization. The real story is older and softer. Clusters of families huddled against a wind, parents shielding a child's eyes from blowing dust, people laughing, flirting, choosing partners, passing on not just their genes, but their music, their stories, their sense of what a beautiful face looks like, generations layering their decisions on top of the quiet work of selection. If you could time-lapse it all, the glaciers advancing and retreating, the forests shifting, the herds moving, the tiny groups of humans following, breaking apart, coming together, you would see faces changing slowly, then faster, then slowly again. You would see eye shapes flow across the map, mixing and remixing, never quite still. And at the end of that long sequence, you would see yours. Your eyes, however they are shaped, are not a mistake or an oddity or an accident. They are one possible solution among many, one variant that happened to make it this far. They belong to a lineage that refused to die, even when the world tried very hard to erase it. Somewhere in your ancestry, whether in Asia, Africa, Europe, the Americas, the islands of the Pacific, or all of the above, people looked out at a dangerous world through eyes very much like yours, and they kept going. As you lie here, in a quiet room, with electric light and recorded sound, You're connected to them by an unbroken thread. Across all the differences of eyelids and skin and bone, every person alive tonight shares that thread. The same species, the same deep bottleneck, the same improbably narrow escape from extinction. When you close your eyes, you erase every visible line that seems to divide us. No folds, no angles, no colours, just darkness and the soft hum of a brain that carries the history of a planet in its cells. Behind those closed lids, remember this: every eye, in every shape, is another way the universe found to keep watching itself. And somewhere, far back in time, long before anyone called themselves Asian or anything else, a small group of survivors looked out at a harsh, uncertain world and decided to live. You're their echo. We all are. So now, as your eyes grow heavy and the room gets quieter, we've walked our way back from a simple question. Why do Asians have small eyes? To something much bigger. Not a joke, not a stereotype, not a punchline. A story. A story that began in ice and wind and darkness, long before anyone looked in a mirror and wondered what they looked like. We followed our ancestors through glacial nights where the air could slice bare skin. We watched them adapt step by step, generation by generation, eyelids thickening, folds deepening, lashes shielding, not because nature was trying to make a particular look, but because every tiny change that protected a pair of eyes from blinding snow or sand gave its owner a slightly better chance to live, to find food, to raise children who would carry those traits forward. We climbed with them into the high plateaus, where the sun is so fierce it burns from above and below, reflecting off rock and ice. We imagined thin air, pounding hearts, lungs pulling at the sky, and eyes trying to cope with a world that is much too bright. Again, small advantages mattered. Slightly narrower openings, slight changes in fat distribution around the eye, subtle tweaks in the skin and bone. Over thousands of years, those tiny details add up into something we can see in the mirror. We trace their long migrations out of Africa, across Eurasia, over mountains and along coasts. We watched as different populations met different climates, different diets, different dangers. In some places, having more exposed eye surface wasn't a problem. In others, it was. In some lands, wind and snow and glare shaped faces one way. In others, humidity and heat and dense forests shaped them another. Along the way, we saw that there was no single Asian eye, just as there is no single European nose or African hair. Instead, there is variation upon variation, layered like sediment, shaped by ice ages and monsoons, by altitude and UV light, by chance and time. Modern genetics stepped in and quietly confirmed what the landscape had already told us. Many genes, each nudging things a little. Eyelid folds, orbital bones, skin thickness, pigmentation. No master switch. No single mutation that made any group look the way they do. Just evolution doing what it always does. Tinkering, testing, keeping what works. We looked beyond climate and DNA to something softer and stranger. Beauty. The way people, in different times and different places, decided which faces felt comforting, desirable, familiar. How, over generations, sexual selection can gently lean populations in particular directions. Not only surviving the cold, but choosing partners whose features feel like home. A slow, quiet feedback loop between the environment outside and the preferences inside. Then we stepped out even further into culture and perception. We watched as empires rose and fell, as fashion changed, as eyes were painted, shaded, stretched, idealized, mocked. We saw how a simple fold of skin became a symbol loaded with meanings that had nothing to do with the Pleistocene winds that first shaped it. How some societies flattened people into caricatures, while others crafted poetry and art around the tiniest details of a gaze. And somewhere in that long arc, the question changed. It stopped being, "Why do they have small eyes?" and became, "What does any face really tell us?" Genetics tells one part of the story. Climate, diet, disease and migration tell another. Culture, history and power add yet more layers. When you put them all together, what you're looking at is not a simple answer. You're looking at a biography written in bone and skin and light. That's the strange, quiet beauty of scientific inquiry. You start with a casual question about appearance, and if you follow it honestly, it carries you into glaciology, into anthropology, into population genetics, into art history. It shows you that every human trait is a doorway. Step through, and you find an entire universe of connections. Ice ages and trade routes, high mountains and coastal villages, love stories and survival strategies, all hidden behind a single blink. So as you lie here, listening, maybe almost asleep, consider your own face for a moment. The curve of your eyelids, the shape of your nose, the shade of your skin. Every line, every contour is the endpoint of countless decisions made by nature and by people who lived long before you. Storms they survived, paths they walked, partners they chose, beliefs they held. You're not random, you're not simple. You're the visible edge of a story that has been written for hundreds of thousands of years. And that's true for everyone, for the stranger on the subway, for the ancestor in an old photograph, for the friend whose features look nothing like yours. When you look at another person's eyes, narrow, wide, hooded, deep set, you're seeing a different route through the same ancient maze. A different journey through cold and heat, through altitude and sea level, through famine and feast. All of us, distant cousins, all of us carrying the mark of those who refused to give up when the world was trying to erase them. If this journey kept you company tonight, if it helped you drift a little closer to sleep while giving your mind something gentle to wander through, you're welcome to tap the like button. It helps more wandering minds find their way here. If you're still awake enough to type, I'd love to know. Where in the world are you listening from? A city or a small town? A high-rise or a quiet village? Somewhere cold? Somewhere warm? Leave a comment and add your little pin to this map of late-night listeners. And if you'd like to go one step further in supporting these slow, careful stories, there's a YouTube membership you can join. It's completely optional, only if it feels right for you. Just knowing you're here, listening and learning, is already more than enough. For now, let the details blur. Let the timelines soften. Ice ages, genes, caravans and old beliefs can fade into the background. All that needs to remain is this simple thought. Every face you will ever see, including your own, is a small miracle of history. Close your eyes, or let them half close, the way our ancestors did against the snow and the wind. Feel your breath slow down. Let your thoughts wander across continents and centuries, then gently let them go. Sleep well, rest deeply, and may your dreams be filled with wonder